Today I'm going to make something with the Behringer Neutron. I think it's a great synth and I really don't use it as often as I should. It's very flexible with its many patch points. Apparently making tracks exclusively with the Neutron is a thing people do, so I thought I'd give this a try, and since I'm currently putting together a Synthwave album, I thought this would be a good job for this guy right here. So let's get right to it. I'm going to start with a kick drum. I'm setting oscillator 1 to a sine wave, and then I'm going to modulate the frequency of oscillator 1 with an envelope. So I'm patching the output of envelope 1 to the input of oscillator 1. Now I need something to trigger that envelope. I will use the LFO for this, so I'm patching its output into the envelope gate 1 input. This might be a bit much, so I'm putting an attenuator in between. I'm patching the envelope 1 output into attenuator 2 in, and then the out of attenuator 2 into oscillator 1. So I get some control over how much modulation I get. I'm turning off the VCA bias now because the amp envelope also gets triggered by the LFO. And I can shape it to my taste. I'm also going to add some filter mod with envelope 2 by increasing this envelope depth here. Maybe some more resonance too. And it's still a bit high, so I'll make it lower. I'm also adding a bit of noise for a crispy attack in the beginning, and I'm increasing the envelope depth a bit to make sure some of those high frequencies actually pass through. I'm also going to use the drive here because why not? Still needs to be a bit lower, I think. Making the whole thing slower. Maybe a little less drive. Now I can still hear a little bit of delay here, even though I've got the mix set all the way to 0. So I'll dial back the repeats into time. I shortened the decay here of the pitch and filter envelope a little bit to make the sound a bit snappier. And I think this is good enough for now, so I'll record a little bit of this and then I'll move on to the next sound. So next I'm going to make a bass. For this I'm going to set oscillator 1 to a square wave. And as you can hear, there's already some pulse width modulation on this. This is by default routed to attenuator 2. Now I'm going to go with this because I like a pulse width modulation sound for a bass. I'm going to set the tuning knobs for both oscillators to around 12 o'clock, just eyeballing it here. And then I'm going to adjust the LFO shape to a triangle. And then I'm going to decrease the amount of modulation so it doesn't go out of tune as much. I'm turning the filter knob because it's fun, and then I'm going to bring in oscillator 2, also setting it to a square wave. Then I'm trying to bring both oscillators in tune. I'm fine with a little bit of detune though. I'm trying different octave settings for oscillator 2, but eventually decide to keep oscillator 2 1 octave above oscillator 1. Next I'm getting out the key step so I can actually figure out a bass line I would like to play. You can hear I've also got my kick playing in the background now. The key step now has got the arpeggiator on, which is kind of convenient for the synthwave kind of thing I have in mind. And I think I will just go with something simple like this. What I like to do is just record a couple of loops of this as MIDI, and then I can quantize it, send it back to the Neutron, and adjust the sound later on. So here we are. Now the MIDI is coming out of the DAW, and I have both my hands free to tweak the knobs. Now I'm just trying a bunch of different stuff. Here I'm adjusting the envelopes, trying to find a good balance between a good sustained low end and a punchy attack nonetheless. Here I'm playing around with the amount of pulse width modulation, and also with the middle setting for the pulse width itself. Trying to find a good spot for the oscillator mix, for the mix of the lower and the higher octave, and a good balance between the cutoff frequency and the filter envelope amount. Here I'm increasing the resonance, which I think gives it a nice retro touch. Setting the tone control of the overdrive section to a pretty high value I think is often also a good idea because it tends to make the sound a little bit dull. Now I'm pretty happy with how this sounds, so I'll record a little bit of this and then I loop it in a DAW. Next I want to make an ARP with kind of an FM sound, so I'm setting oscillator 1 to a sine and oscillator 2 as well, and I'm patching the output of oscillator 2 into the oscillator 1 in. So now the signal of oscillator 2 is modulating the pitch of oscillator 1, giving us these cool sounds. Again, I'm going to attenuate this, so I'll patch attenuator 2 in between the out of oscillator 2 and the in of oscillator 1. I'm going to get an ARP going on the key step now, maybe a little bit higher. Now I'm trying to find a good ratio between oscillator 1 and oscillator 2. This is just pure trial and error. Now I have to tune this to the rest of the track. Again, lots of trial and error. This has proven to be the most efficient way for me when it comes to FM things because it's just a bit unpredictable. Now that I found something that I kind of like, I'm adding some delay to this and I'm trying to sync it more or less to the tempo. Again, messing with the oscillator tuning in the hopes of finding something better. I think this sounds kind of nice, has a good bell-like quality to it. Here I'm trying a high-pass filter. I changed up the ARP a bit here, I made it a bit longer. I've got 6 notes in there now, and you might have noticed I'm using a 3-chord chord progression, so this will line up nicely every time the loop repeats. I'm giving the bandpass filter a try here. Also sounds kind of cool. So I decide to just start recording and keep turning the knobs, knowing that I can still chop it up and rearrange stuff later. Here's a few places where I ended up along the way. Until it got pretty crazy towards the end, but you never know. These kinds of unique sounds, there's often a good use for them. Next, I want to make a lead sound. I have something with a good amount of sustain in mind so I can play long notes. And maybe this time I'm going to use the saw, because I like saws. I'm setting the second oscillator also to a sawtooth. Adding a good amount of delay. I'm gonna detune the oscillators a bit. I'm trying to find the spot where it sounds really wide, but not too wrong. Now I want to control how much the LFO modulates the cutoff frequency with the mod strip on the key step. This assign output on the Neutron you can set to a couple of different things, but I've got it set to the mod strip right now. So I'm patching this into the CV in of attenuator 1 and then the output of the LFO into the attenuator 1 in. So now the mod strip controls how much of the LFO signal comes out of attenuator 1, which I'm going to patch into the frequency mod, which is the modulation of the filter. So now I've got that on the mod strip. This mod depth knob sets the maximum amount of modulation the mod strip goes to. Next, I'll try to use an envelope to control the speed of the LFO. So I'm patching the output of envelope 1 into the LFO rate. Now it speeds up during the attack phase and then it gets slower again during the decay phase. And I would like it the opposite way, so I'm going to invert the signal. So I'll patch the envelope out into the invert in and then the invert out into the LFO rate. Now I'll need to adjust the envelope, and here I'm running into the problem but I need to dial down the sustain. But like I said, I want a sustain sound, so I can't use envelope 1 for this. But maybe I can use envelope 2 for this, because I might not need the filter modulation with envelope 2. Now I can dial up the sustain on the amp envelope again, and dial it down on the filter envelope. And now it goes nicely from fast to slow and then back to fast again. Look at the light up top here, the LFO light, so you can see what's happening. Starts a little bit slow, and then goes pretty quickly to a steady speed during the sustain stage. And when I release the key, it goes back to fast, but we can hardly hear that. So here's the lead line I ended up recording. It's 6 bars long, but it's more divided into 4 and 2 than 3 and 3, so it still fits the 3-bar chord progression, but it's kind of a different feel to it, which I think is kind of interesting. The next thing I want to do here is another kind of lead sound, this time a plucked sound. I've got the 2 oscillators both set to a pulse wave, so I get a really thin sound. I'm adjusting the width of the pulse wave here, trying to get that really hollow sound. I'm tuning oscillator 2 to a 5th above oscillator 1. Filtering the whole thing. The filter envelope helps to give a really bright attack, but only if I make a pause. As long as I'm playing legato, the envelope doesn't get re-triggered. I want to assign the mod strip to the filter here, so I'm patching it into the frequency mod. Now it's not doing anything, I have to dial up the mod depth first, and here we go. I'm turning off the key tracking for the filter. So I'm pretty happy with my sound now, and I'm gonna record a little melody. One more time, a bit more filtered. And a third time, 1 octave above. And that's that. Time for some more drum sounds now. First, a snare. I'm using the key step sequencer here, and I'm recording a sequence, a rest, and then a note. That should give me backbeat. Now I just have to make this sound more like a snare. So I will definitely need some noise here. Next, I want to mute the oscillators so we can hear what the noise sounds like on its own. For this, I'm plugging a dummy cable into the VCF in. We can still hear the noise that's coming into the filter on a separate signal path. I'm adding some drive, I'm adjusting the envelope a bit, and I'm making some adjustments in the filter section. Now I want to bring one of the oscillators back in to make it sound more like a drum, which actually does have a pitch and is not just noise. So I'm patching the output of oscillator 1 here into one of the sum inputs, and into the other one I'll patch the noise. So we're feeding both signals into the filter. The output, of course, of the sum I'm going to patch into the filter. Now the oscillator is too loud for my taste in comparison to the noise, so I'll patch it into attenuator 2, and then the output of attenuator 2 into the sum. So with the attenuator 2 knob, I can adjust the volume of the oscillator. Now it sounds like a very tiny snare because it's a bit high, so I'll make it lower, and I'm also trying out some different wave shapes here. I'm gonna go with kind of a triangle shape. Cool thing about the Neutron is you not only get the standard wave shapes, you can actually morph between them. I'm gonna patch the output of an envelope into the oscillator 1N, so I can slightly modulate the pitch of that oscillator, but again, I'll patch it into an attenuator first because I only want a little bit of that modulation. Now I'm bringing the rest of the track back in to hear what it sounds like in context, and I'm trying the different filter types. I actually like the high pass filter the best. Now I'm trying to tune the cutoff frequency to where the pitch of the drum would actually be, to give it a bit of a resonance boost. Some final adjustments to the envelope, and then I'm ready to record. Here's what the snare sounds by itself. So let's move on to hi-hats. For the hi-hat, I want to use the noise as well, so I'll leave the dummy cable plugged in. And I'm going to use the high-pass filter it pretty drastically, so we get only the very high frequencies, and I'll make it pretty short. I will also try to mix in a FM sound to make it sound more metallic, so I'm patching the output of oscillator 2 again into the in of oscillator 1, and the dangling dummy cable here I'll plug into the out of oscillator 1 now. I'll turn off the noise for a second so I can actually hear what this oscillator 1 sounds like now. And now I'm just trying to get a very inharmonic metallic sound here. This sort of thing is exactly what I'm looking for. So again, I'm patching the outputs of the oscillator 1 and the noise into the sum inputs so I can mix them together, and then the output of the sum into the filter. By pure accident now, this envelope behaves in a way that when the gate is short enough, the release stage kicks in before the envelope gets to the level I have to sustain dial to, so it sounds more like an open head, and if I keep the key pressed down, it sounds very short because it goes all the way down to the low sustain setting. So I could, if I wanted to, use this for open and closed heads, but I'm not going to. I'm simply setting the arpeggiator to 16th notes and keep it going. If I could wish for one thing in the Neutron that isn't there, it'd probably be CV-ins for attack and decay time. I'm really not complaining here because there's already a lot and I wouldn't even know where to put any additional patch points, but I do love some variation in my envelopes. So what I'm gonna do here instead is just turn some knobs while I'm recording to get some more interesting sounds and rhythms. Here I'm increasing the mod depth, which leads to some LFO modulation of the filter. With the LFO being synced to the tempo, this kind of adds another interesting layer to the rhythm. Here I'm increasing the attack time, which gives me more of a shaker sound than a hi-hat. And then again, here's the crazy ending to match what I did with ARP before. So I recorded some of these things as well, and now is probably a good time to just have a look at what I've got so far and how I could possibly put this together to a track that makes sense and what it is still missing, so I know what I still have to do on the Neutron. So here I am staring at the computer screen, and I've edited this a little bit, and here you can see what I've got so far. So all the gray stuff is muted, as you can see, and I added a part here where I only have one bass note. Then kind of a breakdown part. Yeah, just arrange things a little bit in a way I thought it makes sense. And what I'm definitely missing now is some arrangement effects, some noise sweep, stuff like that. Maybe even some drum fills, some more percussion stuff would be nice. I thought maybe something with the Paraphonic mode on the Neutron would be nice. But yeah, I think this might be getting somewhere. So I will get right back to it and hopefully come up with some interesting stuff. So I'm going to do some noise sweeps now. I'm leaving the dummy cable plugged in because I don't want the oscillators to go into the filter. And then I'm adding some delay and just doing some good old manual noise sweeps. I'm recording a couple of different versions of this and I'm going to place it in Next, I want to attempt another kind of noise thing where the mod strip affects both the LFO rate and the cutoff frequency at the same time. So I'm going to patch the assign out, which is the mod strip, into the mult in, so I can distribute it to different places. And then I'm patching one out of the mult into the LFO rate. And the other one, I want to affect the frequency, but if I plug it straight into the frequency mod, the LFO is not going to affect the frequency anymore. So I'm plugging it into one of the sum ins, and into the other sum in, I'm going to plug the output of the LFO. And the output of the sum then goes into the input of the cutoff frequency. So now the mod strip affects both LFO rate and cutoff frequency. So again, I'm recording some of this, not sure yet whether I'm going to have any use for it, but we'll see. Next, I want to do another percussion thing. So for this, I'm getting rid of all these cables again. This is what it sounds like right now, and the arpeggiator already gives me a synced rhythm. And now I want to modulate the pitch with a thin envelope, again like I did with the kick. So it sounds a little bit like a drum, like a tom or something. So I'm plugging the output of the envelope into the input of both oscillators. Now I need to adjust the envelope so it goes from high to low in a reasonable amount of time. I'm going to attenuate this as well because it's just too much with the entire signal. So I'm plugging it into the attenuator 1 in and then the output of the attenuator into the oscillator 1 and 2 frequency. So this gives me these laser beam kind of sounds, and I'm going to adjust the amp envelope as well to make it short and not as messy. Attenuator 1 here has a CVN, so I'm going to see what happens if I modulate the amount of envelope modulation of the pitch with the LFO. Now I'm also going to attenuate the signal that I'm using to modulate the amount of attenuation, if that makes sense. So this way the LFO doesn't have as much of an influence on the amount of pitch mod anymore. The more I dial up attenuator 2 here, the wider the span from high to low gets. I'm using the key step here to make a little sequence. The rhythm pattern here, of course, is more important than the actual notes because we're not going to hear those all that much anyway. Now it's too slow, so I speed it up. I'm going to set the filter type to a bandpass, and then I'm adjusting its settings a bit. And lastly, I'm going to add a quite fast delay. And then again, I'll just start to record, turn the knobs, and hope that I'll end up in some nice places. Now I'm going to get rid of the cables and just do some freestyle noise. Here I'm turning a bit on the tuning knob. Always gives us fun sounds. Trying some different shapes here. Here I turned off the arpeggiator so the envelopes don't get triggered and I'm entirely freewheeling. Next, I want to do something with the paraphonic mode on the Neutron, meaning that the two oscillators get separate pitch info from the key step. So I can play 2 notes at a time. I'm thinking just a simple rhythm pattern with some thirds. I'm using a couple of saws here. I think it makes most sense to have both oscillators set to the same wave shape and they're played independently. And here I'm trying to get the thing in tune with the track. And then I'm adjusting the envelope a bit to make it pluckier. And here's the pattern I recorded. Yeah, and that's the last thing I did. In the track in the background you can already hear I did some arranging, moved some of the effects and noise stuff into their places, trying to glue everything together nicely. So it might be time to hear this track in its entirety. Let me know what you think. I'm curious to hear, and regardless of whether you like it or not, I would like to thank you a lot for watching. So yeah, that's what I ended up with. Maybe a couple of words on what I did in the DAW. It's really not a whole lot. I added a little bit of reverb to one of the lead sounds, the sustained one, and the snare, just because it's really hard without any reverb at all. And then I added some high-pass filters to some of the tracks just to get rid of some muddiness. And that's about it. Put a ozone mastering plugin on the whole thing and just let it do its thing on autopilot. And oh yeah, maybe on 1 or 2 tracks I put an imager, isotope imager plugin on there to make it seem a bit more stereo. I think it's just a really fast stereo delay kind of thing, working differently on the different frequency ranges. Don't ask me how exactly it works, but it adds some stereo depth to signals that are mono. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks a lot for watching. Bye bye.